Welcome to Madlik. My name is Jeffrey Stern, and at Madlik we like to shed a little light or light a spark under a Jewish tradition, concept, or text. Today we're going to explore sinning. Yes, that's right, you heard it first here on Madlik, but sinning for the sake of heaven. And in that regard, I have a little confession to make. I find it very hard to sit in front of a microphone and record a podcast. I find it much easier when I'm giving a class to slap on a microphone and record myself live. And because many times I teach a class on Shabbat, it may be that some of these podcasts which are recorded live were recorded on Shabbat. Well, that's an Aveira Lishma. It's a sin that's done for the sake of heaven. And that's what this podcast is all about. So sit down, buckle up, get the kids out of the room, and get ready to hear about sinning in a whole new light. Today's a very special subject. It's called Sinning for God, and in Hebrew that means Aveira Lishma, which literally means Aveira is a sin. Lishma is for the name, or that's short for L'Shem Shemayim, for the sake of heaven. And the first time I ever heard that expression, I was a young bachur at the yeshiva, and I was bothered by the fact that I didn't come from a religious background. And when I went home, and obviously I wanted to show the beauty of Judaism, if a woman stuck out their hand to me, I stood there like a flopper. I wouldn't shake it. And I thought that it was doing a disservice to Judaism because they didn't understand why I wasn't shaking the hand. And what's the big deal? So I went to the mashgiach of Tovdas, and I have a picture here that I took of him on Purim. So you can see his hands are raised, he's singing, he was a chassid, he was a Kabbalist. And I say, what should I do? So he says to me, well, there was a scholar named Judges.Etz Hayim. Now, if you know the history of modern Orthodoxy, Judges.Etz Hayim and Samson Raphael Hirsch started modern Orthodoxy in Germany. So for have a guy like that quoting Judges.Etz Hayim was like, I don't know, Orthodox rabbi going to a Reform scholar and saying, what do you think? And he told me, according to him, it's not such a big deal nowadays. It's not a sign of endearment. And then he thought, and he thought, and he thought, and he looked up and he goes, but there's also a concept of Aveira Lishma, of sinning for God's name. And that was the real answer. The real answer was, I'm not going to whitewash it. You're not supposed to shake a woman's hand. But if you feel that it's putting Judaism in the wrong light and they won't understand it, sin for the sake of God. And I just thought that was so radical and so amazing. It really struck me. And then a year or two later, I was studying, this is the tractate of Ketubot. It deals with marriage contracts and stuff like that. And I went to prepare for this lesson, and there's a Tosfot that in regard to Esther talks about Aveira Lishma. And sure enough, I underlined it and wrote in the thing, Aveira Lishma. So this is something that has intrigued me for a long time. I mean, it's, besides the fact that I have my personal history with him, it's a pretty cutting-edge concept, sinning for God's name. So if you take out your sheets, we're basically going to be dealing with 4 women today. The first is Esther. And as I said, in that Tosfot, which is a commentary on the Talmud, it talks about Aveira Lishma relates to Esther. But we're going to go to the Talmud in Megillah. And it says, if you recall, Esther sent a message to Mordecai. She said, go gather together all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night and day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go into the king, not according to the custom. So we normally learn this. First of all, this is the reason we fast before Purim. It's Tzom Esther, in remembrance of what she did. And we normally learn the pshat of the verse is that you couldn't go to the king unannounced. And so for the first time, she was going to go into the king's court, and for coming into the king's court unannounced, uninvited, it was punishable by death. But that's not the way the Talmud understands it. Rabbi Abba said, it will not be according to my usual custom, for every day until now when I submitted myself to Ahasuerus, I was under compulsion, right? She was in the harem, and when he called for her, they made love. It was compulsive. But now I will be submitting myself to him of my own free will. And Esther further said, and if I perish, I perish. So again, the standard interpretation is if the king kills me. But in this case, what she means is, what she meant was, just as I was lost to my father's house ever since I was brought here, so too shall I be lost to you. For after voluntarily having relations with Ahasuerus, I shall be forever forbidden to you. So who's she talking to? She's talking to Mordecai. Now, what was the relationship? What was the relationship between Mordecai and Esther?
He was an uncle, but they were all Jews, so she meant they were all not going specifically, but to the Jewish person, to the Jewish people.
So, just to be clear about Jewish law, was she married? No. So she's not married. A bastard, a mamzer, comes out of a union of a married man to a married woman. A married woman is the key, okay? So this isn't even that big of a deal. It's not nice. You wouldn't want your daughter in that situation. But from a halachic point of view, and what's the thing about being forbidden to Mordecai? So you have to understand a subtext. If you look at the footnotes, but you don't have to because I'll tell it to you, the rabbis almost go out of their way to make this into a big sin. And how do they do that? Esther, it says in the Megillah, was an orphan. Okay, she lost her mother and father. It says, according to the rabbinic tradition, Esther was married to Mordecai. The verse states, and when her father and mother were dead, Mordecai took her for his own daughter. A Tana brought a breita in the name of Rabbi Meir. Do not read the verse literally for a daughter, bat, but rather read it for a home, buy it. This indicates that Mordecai took Esther to be his wife. So now the rabbis have raised a bar that Esther was married to Mordecai. Until now, when she went into the king, it was onus. It was not her volition, and she would have been permitted to go back to Mordecai. So now, not only has she lost her parents, avadati, she's also going to lose Mordecai, because after this act, she will not be able to go back to Mordecai. And of course, there's also the sense of loss to God. She's sinning. She's sinning by her own volition. She's asking the Jewish community to pray for her, but she's sinning. She's breaking the law, breaking God's law. Okay? Now, one thing that I will point out to you is the word for the custom is kadat. It's not minhag. And this is just a very small aside. How do you refer in Hebrew to a religious person? Dati. This is the first time it appears in Jewish literature. It's not a Hebrew word, it's a Persian word. It's a whole other story that we can have a study group about, but this is a very interesting point because there are scholars who say that Judaism only started becoming a religion as opposed to whatever we call it, which is a way of life, or ethnicity, at this time period when they started giving it a name. We'll come back to that another time. So the question now becomes, how does this fit into our tradition? This concept of Esther breaking the law for a higher good, taking one for the team, so to speak. Okay? So now let's go to Tamar. Who knows the story of Tamar? Judah and Tamar. So Judah is one of the 12 sons, right? And he has 2 children. And you can look this up. We're not. Anyway, you can look it up. He has 2 children, and the first one marries a woman named Tamar, and he dies. I don't know his name, but I remember the second son's name. The second son's name is Onen. And he figures, my brother just died from this woman. She's like a black widow. I'm not going to lie with her. So every time before he lies with her, he masturbates. And from that comes the word onanism. Okay? And divorces her. Or maybe he dies too. This woman then dresses up as a prostitute, stands by the side of the street, and waits for the father to walk by and seduces him. Because, according to the tradition, she wants the progeny of the tribe of Judah who eventually ends up with David.
Wasn't that a law, Levirate marriage?
Levirate marriage is there is a responsibility by Onan to marry her, and he didn't fulfill his responsibility. She went a little bit further and went up the family tree to the father. Okay? And Ruth and Boaz is part of it too. If you think a little bit, Ruth kind of seduced Boaz. Okay, but she did not make the A list, but she is in the B list. So the A list. Ula said, we're now at Tamar. Ula said, Tamar engaged in licentious sexual intercourse with her father-in-law Judah, and Zimri ben Salu also engaged in licentious sexual intercourse with a Midianite woman. Remember him? This was the Jews are in the desert, and the Midianites, Bilam fails. Cursing the Jews won't work. So the Midianites get smarter. We'll make them sin. So they send all the girls down, and the most famous girl and Zimri are making love in front of everybody, and Pinchas come and put a spear through them. Pinchas ben Yael. And as a result, 2,400 people were killed. So it's comparing Tamar, who engaged in a forbidden act, and Zimri also engaged in licentious sexual with a Midianite woman. Tamar engaged in licentious sexual intercourse and merited that kings descended from her, and she also merited to be the ancestor of prophets. Isaiah was related. Conversely, with regard to Zimri, several multitudes of Israel fell due to him. Okay? So they're comparing two types of averot, two types of transgressions. Now we get to the payload here. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, greater is a transgression committed for its own sake, we'll get into the translation in a second, for the sake of heaven, than a mitzvah performed not for its own sake. So in Hebrew it is, Gedola Avera Lishma, Mitzvah Shelo Lishma. So we're going to be focusing on Avera Lishma, doing the sin for heaven, because it's not altogether clear how this works out with Zimri. It's not like Zimri was doing a mitzvah Shelo Lishma. Okay? He was just sinning. But the point is, it does give you a sense of how high they held, this rabbi held, doing one of these averas, doing one of these sins for a higher good. It's better than even just putting on tefillin every morning without thinking about it. That means lo lishma. You're not thinking about it. You're going through the routine. Okay? So in a sense, it's comparing greatness for the moment, taking that act, to just going through the road. Changing history or just doing nothing. But we'll let the text talk for itself. The Gemara questions this comparison. But didn't Rabbi Yehuda say that Rav said a person should always occupy himself with Torah and mitzvot, even not for their own sake? As it is through acts performed not for their own sake that good deeds for their own sake come about. So this is beautiful Hebrew. And the Hebrew is Shemitoch Shelo Lishman Bar Lishman. So the concept is, if you come to shul every day and you put on the tefillin, why is it good? Because one day you're going to want to put on tefillin, you're going to need those tefillin, you'll know how to do it, the gears are going to be well oiled. And the point is, if you do, it's a kind of a behavioristic philosophy as well. If you do good deeds, you become a good person. If you talk nicely, ultimately it affects you. So it's a very beautiful philosophy, and I think there's a lot of sense to it, but he's arguing with the part of the prior principle that's put down mitzvah shelo lishman. He's focusing on that part. He's not arguing with the fact that avera lishma, doing a sin for God's name, is a great thing, but he's saying, why are you putting down, why are you disparaging just going through the routine? Okay. So now the Gemara continues, and we're talking about another lady. Her name is Yael. Does everybody remember the story? We read it in the Haftorah of Yael and Sisera. Remember, the Jews were fighting a war, and the king comes to a tent, and Yael lets him in. He says, hide me. And she gives him some milk, and he falls asleep, puts a stake through his head, saves the Jewish people. Okay? Did she do any sin? Okay. Besides that, what have the Romans not done? Besides killing him, this was not a sin because he was an enemy combatant, okay? What else did she do? So here again, we're seeing another trend. Watch what the rabbis do to her. So Yael, I'm reading Yael now. Rather say, a transgression for the sake of heaven is equivalent to a mitzvah not for its own sake. So they're toning down the statement of Rav Yehuda, said in the name of Rav, or in the name of Ula. The proof as it is written, blessed above women shall Yael be, the wife of Hever the Kenite. Above women in the tent shall she be blessed. And it is taught, who are these women in the tent? They are Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. Yael's forbidden intercourse.
We didn't hear that.
Who said anything about intercourse? These rabbis, I'm telling you, they're for the sake of heaven is compared to the sexual intercourse in which the matriarchs engaged. Okay? The matriarchs who gave birth to the Jewish people, the fact that supposedly, allegedly, she slept with Sisera, she has the same merit. She's equivalent. Okay? Now, of course, there's a big problem here, because if you look, the verse says, blessed above women shall Yael be. It doesn't say equal. It says above. I'm not going to get into it. The proof test is not a great one, and there's a variant piece of Talmud on this that says it's better. She was better than them. How do the rabbis know that they had intercourse? Rabbi Yoḥanan said, the wicked one, Sisera, engaged in 7 acts of sexual intercourse with Yael at that time. As it is stated, between her feet he sunk, he fell, he lay, between her feet he sunk, he fell, and where he sunk, there he fell down dead. 7 times. Did you hear the pattern there? Anyway, each mention of falling is referring to another act of intercourse. And that relates to what you were saying last night about Haman when he fell on Esther in the back room. You know, it's easy to interpret that kind of language, at least if it's 7 is a little, whatever.
That's a lot. I didn't know they had that.
So the patterns that we're starting to see, on the one hand, these women, the rabbis are looking up to these women in admiration. The rabbis are creating a paradigm of breaking the law. However, we can't but notice that all the people so far that we've seen who are engaged in this wonderful thing of doing an Avera Lishma are what gender? Women. And they're all breaking, not by killing, not by stealing, but through sexual acts. Seduction. Okay? So it's almost as if this concept of Avera Lishma is linked to women, and it's linked to seduction, and it's also linked, at least in the case of Tamar and Esther, and it's related to saving the Jewish people.
Well, what other power would women have? That is women's power.
Okay.
Especially, in the context of those times.
It's a good point. So in the case of Tamar, she's saving the Jewish people in terms of heritage, in terms of genetics, in terms of DNA. Without her mating with Judah, the line is going to be lost. In the case of the other two, Yael and Esther, she's saving the Jewish people physically. Let's go to the last example that the Talmud brings. Lot's daughters. Rabbi Abba said that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha said, a person should always come first with regard to a matter of a mitzvah, as in reward of the one night that the elder daughter of Lot preceded the younger for the sake of a mitzvah. She merited to precede the younger daughter by 4 generations to the monarchy of the Jewish people. Does anybody know what's going on here? What's the story of Lot's daughters? Sodom is destroyed. The daughters of Lot And they were like kids from Westport. They thought that that's the end of the world. This is the whole world here. Nothing exists besides this town. So they go out into the desert, and mom gets killed. She turns around, turns into a pillar of salt. So they go into a cave, and they think the world is destroyed. So it's up to them to procreate, to bring the future. So there are 2 daughters, and the rabbis learn that since the oldest daughter took the initiative and says, I'm going to make them drunk, I'm going to lie with them first, from there we learn that you should always rush to do a mitzvah. So keep that in mind. When you and your buddy are walking to shul and you want to step ahead, think of Lot's daughters. That's a perfect example to keep in your mind. It's amazing. 2 things. Number 1, that they're using this as an example of running to do a mitzvah. And 2, again, that it's so obvious to them what she did was a great mitzvah. And again, it relates to the heritage. So what the argument is that Ruth was a Moabite, and she, because of this act, Moab means from the father. So they had incestuous sex with the father. They had a child. She called her Moab, from the father. And the descendant was Ruth, who married Boaz, who was in the line of King David, the king, the Messiah, the future redemption. Okay? The second daughter, who wasn't as pushy to be first, did it the second night, and she got into the kingly line later on. So that's the lesson that the rabbis learned. So again, we have another example. Now these are not Jews. Lot and Lot's daughters were not Jews. Of course, you can say at the time of Abraham, what was a Jew, what was not a Jew. Any comments so far? Because this is the end of, we're going to go off-road after this. This is the end of the tradition of Aveira Lishma, doing a sin for God's name.
Are there any examples of men's acts?
The example, there are more examples that the commentaries bring, like Abraham is going to Avimelech, he lies about his wife, but ultimately the Aveira Lishma there too is he pimps her off. And Sarah is doing exactly what Esther did. There's a strong tradition for this. And it happens with Isaac as well. Okay? There are some that say that in the golden calf situation, but these are all commentaries, that Aaron is approached by the children of Israel. They want to have a golden calf, and the guy that they asked before, they killed when he said no. So Aaron, either because he wants to live, or because he says, if I say yes, I can manage the situation. So there are some commentaries that say he was doing an Aveira Lishma. He was helping them engage in idol worship in order to save lives. In order, he says, go get the jewelry from your wives. He figured the wives will never give him the jewelry, that'll stop him. Then he goes, wait a day. Or, he was trying to be part of the solution, but by doing it, he was sinning. But the traditional examples all have to relate to a sexual encounter and to women. And it's interesting because it's held at such a high regard. I mean, again, it's funny that the rabbis say you can learn from Lot's daughters how to approach a mitzvah. But the fact that they say it shows in how high regard, and they realize that without these moments, the Jewish people, the line of David, would not be there. So, yes, that he was living with a Philistine? Yeah. The interesting thing is, I saw one crazy commentary who said that Zimri, because it said a second ago, it wasn't clear what the story was. There was a mitzvah lishma against Aveira Lishma against. They tried to say that Zimri was up to some good. He had some good intentions. I mean, the point is, it's not. I don't believe there were traditions for it. Although, you always find traditions that kind of justify the behavior of King David with Bathsheba and all that. But to say that he was doing a mitzvah and to use this language is literally in the Talmud very rarely, and only in these three cases. Even Esther, I had to go to that commentary on the side to the Tosfot. But the iconic examples of doing a vera, a sin, for the sake of God, even though you're breaking God's laws, it's not altogether clear that God told her to do it. So when it doesn't say, I titled the discussion "Sinning for God," but it's not altogether clear that it's with God's permission.
I thought you could get a larger audience.
It was. Yeah. I should have.
Simplistic one that if you eat something or do something to save your own life, there is no alternative. You're sinning if you're eating something not kosher. That would be simplistic.
So in this Tosfot that describes all this, there's this thing called pikuach nefesh, that in order to live, you can break everything except three rules. Shpichat damim is killing somebody. Avodah Zarah is worshiping an idol, and Gilei Arayot is exactly what we're talking about here, sexual impropriety. So they ask the question, if you're forced, and that's what Esther is saying, until now I've been forced. And the commentaries even go further when you do it in front of the public. So at the end of the Talmud that says you can't do that, and they say, and even to change a shoelace in front of the whole, let's say if the Roman gladiator takes you in front of the whole public, says, you Jew, I don't want you wearing that blue shoelace like the Jews do, I want you taking it off. Because he's making a example of you, then you can't do it. So there's this discussion that what Esther is doing is very public. So not only, it's not even close. For later.
For later, okay. And your meeting. Sorry, number 2 and 3. That's 1, 4 and 5.
You reading?
Don't worry, two got bars. Show up.
Anybody who really is good is in here right now.
Okay, well, we'll think about it. We can. Okay, yeah. So was there a question? Yeah, so the fact that she did it in public is also a big deal. This was the pinnacle of doing an Aveira Lishma. Okay? Yes?
In today's world, so you have different rabbinical authorities, but let's just pick one, the conservative movement. People have an infinite ability to rationalize anything. So if I say I'm sinning for God and I talk to Rabbi Yoḥanan, for instance, what is is there a modern text that rabbis refer to say this is okay or this is not okay?
So some of the commentaries say that after Matan Torah, there's no more Aveira Lishma. Unfortunately, that doesn't really work because Esther was after Matan Torah, and so was Yael. But certainly the rabbis try to make closure on this, because as you can imagine, this is a very dangerous thing. And according to the Kabbalah, there's a special holiness when you get close to unholiness. So I'll give you a quick example. When you make matzah before Pesach, everything's great. If you make this, there's something called matzah mitzvah, which is done after the hour that you're not allowed to have chametz anymore. So you're literally making matzah, and everything that's falling to the floor is forbidden, and that's considered the holiest matzah. It's like walking on the thing. We have other examples of that. You're not allowed to have wool and linen together. In the talit, you are. So there is this sense of holiness is getting close to the taboo. The biggest thing that happened in Judaism was Shabtai Tzvi. So what happened with him is he took this Kabbalistic notion to the extreme, and he took this sense of if Jews are all good or Jews are all bad, the Messiah will come. This concept of almost forcing the hands. You won't come, I'll force you to. We'll all sin. And he did orgies, and then he converted to Islam. And some people stayed with him. But it kind of put that and the emancipation and the Enlightenment put a damper on this. So it was, from that reason, it was very exciting that he said to me, there's something called an Aveira Lishma. Because it's a very dangerous, tricky thing. And you would, but people like Rav Kook understood it. So when they would look at the Chalutzim, who were draining the swamps on Shabbat, and he said they are the Holy of Holies, he was coming from that mentality. So here's my question, because we started this series looking at Eve. Okay? If you had to put Eve into this category, let's think of what she has and what she doesn't. Did she sin? Big time. Okay? No sex yet, but she sinned. Okay? Is she responsible for the future of humanity? I think so. I think David came from her along with everybody else. Okay? So if you look at this tradition, how would you look at Eve and say that her sin was an Aveira Lishma?
Don't see it.
Because, wait, let me word it. First of all, it was the tree of knowledge, and we're supposed to have knowledge. So by eating from the fruit and discovering their nakedness, i.e. starting to procreate, then she assured our bloodline.
Okay. Anybody else?
Did she reach that level of understanding? She's the first person on earth. Was she thinking about
She's the second person on earth.
About the nations?
Depends which one you read.
Okay.
No, but somebody helped her to understand that she should take, somebody like the snake.
Snake?
He was the one who told her to do it. She didn't realize. I mean, we don't know if she knew to take or not to take.
So who's...
She knew, the God told her, don't take, right, he told Balaam and Eve not to take from, not to touch the tree.
Yeah.
But the snake's a metaphor.
Well, you could say Adam and Eve is a metaphor too.
It's true. It's true. Maybe she was able to seduce Adam, and that was really the act of knowing the tree of knowledge.
So I looked at feminist commentaries on the Bible, because who else would justify Eve and look underneath the surface for good motives? And on the second sheet we have them, but let's follow up with what Elise said. You can clearly make the argument that when God said, Lo tov liot adam levado, it's not good that man should be alone. If you look at the commentaries, it says, like me. Man is alone, the only being that's unique. I'm alone. Now, if you're alone, was Adam going to procreate by himself? There were some commentaries that said he was androgynous, but you don't need sex if you live forever. Okay? So there is a connection between death and sex. Once
The Victorians called orgasm a little death.
So once you introduce mortality, the only way the species can survive is through procreation. So you can make, and we're not going to read all of these women commentaries, feminist commentaries, because they're all brilliant. And of course, they're not dealing with our situation here. But I'll give you another example. It says that Adam was standing next to Eve when the snake came. Who's doing all the talking? Who's engaging? Who's the active one here? She fits exactly into Esther makes the move. She changes the arc of history. Yael makes the move. The two girls make the move. It's not Lot who's saying, how are we going to continue the species? So these are women that are also taking, and the quote that I have is from The Harlot by the Side of the Road by Jonathan Kirsch. If you look at Eve, it says, starting with Eve and that damned apple, women have been depicted and mostly condemned as the willful and wily seducers of men. Even the daughter of the patriarch Jacob, a woman who is the apparent victim of rape, is blamed for some of the more misogynistic rabbinical sages by provoking her rapist. That's Dinah. Listen to this minority opinion. And a minority tradition in the rabbinical literature teaches a similar conclusion about Lot's daughters. Lot is a warning example to men to avoid being alone with women, lest they entice them to sin, as did Lot's daughters. So here's another opinion in the Bible who looks at Lot's daughters and says, this is where Vice President, what's his name? Pence got it from. You're not allowed to be alone with a woman because you might sin. Where do we learn that? Lot's daughters. That rabbinic authority saw nothing magnanimous or redeeming about what Lot did. So there's a long tradition in blaming the women. But he goes on much later in the book. However, an open-eyed reading of the Bible reveals that women play a crucial and dynamic role in the destiny of humankind. In both Jewish and Christian tradition, inevitably, a woman figures decisively in the recurring theme of the birth of the chosen one, starting with the matriarchs of the Hebrew Bible and culminating with the Virgin Mary in the Christian Bible. As we've already seen, Lot's daughters and Judah's daughter-in-law, Tamar, are example of how the bearer of the chosen one is not passively impregnated with the seed of a matriarch. Rather, these women take it upon themselves to defy the will of powerful men and sometimes God himself in order to bring about the crucial birth. Indeed, the Bible frequently singles out the woman as initiator of events. As a certain commentary says, from Eve through Sarah and Esther, women have shaped sacred history through word and deed. So if you look at it that way, it opens up a whole new way of commentary, and it opens up the need for these feminist commentators who are looking and trying to understand what Eve's motivation was. And you can look at many motivations. So there's the one motivation about simply she said, look, this is not tenable. We are not mortal. Wake up. We've got to eat from this tree of knowledge of mortality / sex, love, procreation, creating. And she did all the talking. Another one is, if you look at all of the so-called punishments that came after the sin of eating from the apple, it's you're going to toil by the sweat of your brow, you're going to get food. Not a bad thing, okay? That you're going to... Childbirth will be painful. In terms of everything, if you look at this story as a story that kind of justifies our condition, which most people who look at a myth like this says, okay, we needed a myth in the Torah to explain death. How did that happen? So you have this whole story. But in a sense, you can certainly make the case that Eve is the mover here. Eve is the one who created our current condition, which isn't all that bad.
Well, she usurped the creation.
She usurped the creation, and there are verses that people say that God was happy afterwards because he was the only one. But the point is that Esther, and I think that the whole holiday of Purim celebrates this fact, not only of women, but of us taking history into our own hands and doing what needs to be done. And that's why God's not mentioned in the Megillah. Anyway, happy Purim. So I like to end every podcast with some music, and I would have loved to have found some music with the voice of a woman, but I was not able to. But I did find a song that I had never heard before by a certain Rav Yehuda Henkin. Henkin is a very famous name in rabbinic circles. And it puts to music the verse that we started with from the Megillah, about Esther asking Mordecai to gather the people together to fast on her behalf. And when she says, and if I perish, I perish. So listen to this beautiful song, and you can find it on YouTube if you look for it, and have a wonderful Purim, and look forward to my next podcast. Hopefully we won't have to wait so long.
לך כנוס את כל היהודים, צומו עליי לילה ויום, אל תאכלו 3 ימים, גם אני ונערותי אצום כן, אצום כן, גם אני ונערותי אצום כן. לך כנוס את כל היהודים, צומו עליי לילה ויום, אל תאכלו 3 ימים, גם אני ונערותי אצום כן, אצום כן, גם אני ונערותי אצום כן. ובכן אבוא אל המלך אשר לא חדת, ובכן אבוא אל המלך אשר לא חדת, וכאשר עבדתי, בכאשר עבדתי. לך כנוס את כל היהודים, צומו עלי לילה ויום, אל תאכלו 3 ימים, גם אני ונערותי אצום כן, אצום כן, גם אני ונערותי אצום כן. לך כנוס את כל היהודים, צומו עלי לילה ויום, אל תאכלו 3 ימים, גם אני ונערותי אצום כן, אצום כן, גם אני ונערותי אצום כן. ובכן אבוא אל המלך אשר לא חדת, ובכן אבוא אל המלך אשר לא חדת, וכאשר עבדתי, וכאשר עבדתי,